Hi, my name is Carrie Smart, local architect. I'm here to welcome you today to a presentation put on by the South Vancouver Island RAIC network. This will be the first of two presentations on climate change. Climate change is arguably the most pressing issue of our time. We're all dealing with the daily repercussions of climate change, whether it be flooding, heat domes, wildfires, or extreme weather events. The impacts are global and local, and the solutions can be cooperative and individual. Today, this talk will provide a narrative on climate change impacts and assess the challenges and future solutions. What can we do to address this long-running crisis? Our moderator is Chris Gower, architect and chapter chair. The format today will be 4 panelists presenting. Then we will have a roundtable, a question and answer period. I would like to thank the panelists that are presenting today. William Patrick Lucy Sr., aquatic ecologist, Aquatech Scientific Consulting, Victoria, BC. Andrew Weaver, professor, School of Earth and Ocean Sciences, University of Victoria. Dr. Jed McLean, executive director of the BC Centre for Innovation and Clean Energy. Tiffany Workington, acting director of strategic policy, Building and Safety Standards Branch, Office of Housing and Construction Standards, Ministry of Attorney General and Ministry responsible for housing. Now on with the session.
My name is Patrick Lucy. I am a professional biologist. My background is in oceanography, marine biology, freshwater microbial ecology, resource management, and urban geography. And I have spent pretty much 50 years in a broad range of land use developments. So on the much larger picture, if we go back a very long way in human history, the history of human interactions with nature can really be summed up in 3 time periods. Hunters and gatherers. These were groups that largely destroyed the large animals that were readily available to them, and that affected profoundly the vegetation of the era. Agriculturalists, shift in nutritional mode. This was domination of nature and the exhaustion of the soil through agriculture. And then in the last 150, 200 years, what I call and others call the scientific industrial complex, technological advances that have made it possible for man to systematically destroy our renewable resources. So at the current time, human land use now, and to a large extent in the oceans, it accounts for about 40% of the planet's resource production going to just us. And this has resulted in a classic scenario called death by 1,000 cuts, although I guess now it's in the millions. So this systematic destruction of resources has led really to an urgent situation. Wildlife populations are in serious decline because the native plants they depend on are fast disappearing. The solution is actually quite simple: plant more natives. So the rest of my discussion is really focusing on more of the urban and peri-urban environment, although I work at all scales. So what is required, in my opinion, is a grassroots approach to conservation. And many others are talking about this as well. Turn backyards into conservation corridors that recreate wildlife habitats. So a private individual-based approach is immune from the whims of government policy. It's practical, effective, and easy. What we really need to understand is the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. We're really talking about nutritional food webs here, because biodiversity is not a species issue. It is a functional issue. We need to understand the trophic webs upon which food webs are based, functional groups of species, not individual species. The organizational strategy is really quite simple, and this is from 1996, coming out of 2 senior bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. for the Bureau of Land Management. Restoration will not happen by regulation, changes in the law, more money, or any of the normal bureaucratic approaches. It will only occur through the integration of ecological, economic, and social factors and participation of the affected interests. It really is working directly with people on the land at their location, focusing on their issues. With my colleagues and my students, mostly graduate students, we have built and restored many landscapes, from single family yards to entire watersheds. The irony is the final outcome has always been way more profitable, not way more costly. So how do we do this? It's really quite simple. The design mode is engineered ecology. It's eco-mimicry. We move historically from engineering through environmental engineering to engineered ecology. I'll leave it at that.
So I'm going to take a slightly different perspective from and talk a little bit about some of the reasons why I think it's important to act now as opposed to delay for the future. I'm doing this in two capacities. One as a professor at the University of Victoria and someone who's served as a lead author on numerous IPCC reports up until 2013, and also as somebody who spent 7.5 years in the BC legislature leading the BC Green Party and holding the balance of power in a minority government that brought in the Clean BC climate plan here in BC, as well as worked federally with the development of the federal climate plan. So why do we care about this issue and why do we need to deal with it now? And that's summarized in this one figure. In fact, this one figure summarizes the entire issue of global warming and boils it down to one question. Do we, the present generation, owe anything to future generations in terms of the quality of the environment we leave behind, yes or no? It's as simple as that. If yes, that will convince you that we must act now, and we must act dramatically so now. If no, who cares about global warming? The way I illustrate that is by showing these two columns, each containing 4 different pictures. On the first column, you see slightly lighter colors, and it's averaged over the period 2016 to 2013, 5. This is showing the annual average temperature change over the whole globe relative to the years 1986 to 2005. And the second column shows the same thing, but at the end of the century. And these 4 different scenarios here are 4 different pathways of future emissions. Very fossil fuel intensive one, the pathway we're currently on, to the bottom, which is a very green one where we actually have negative emissions introduced relatively rapidly and so forth. Why this figure summarizes it all is if you look at the first few panels, first panels, they all show the same thing, an average of about 0.5 degrees globally warmer, in each case independent of the emissions trajectory, whereas the type of world that is left at the end of the century fundamentally is determined by the emissions trajectory we're moving out forward with. And therein lies the political conundrum, is that those making the decisions today do not have to live the consequences of the decisions they make. Yet those who live the consequences of decisions being made today are the generation to follow who are not part of that decision-making process. That is the whole issue of global warming. Boils down to the question, do we or do we not owe anything to future generations? For if we do, delay is too late. Socioeconomic inertia in our built environment is such that the kind of warming we have in store in the next decade or two is really in the cards based on our existing infrastructure. The decisions we make today will determine how the planet evolves for the rest of the century. So why should we care? Well, assuming we care about intergenerational equity, the other 2 big issues that global warming is causing concern about is, one, widespread species extinction, as pointed out by Patrick, but also the notion of geopolitical instability. That is, the disproportionate effects of climate change are occurring in regions that don't have the economic wherewithal to adapt, and so sows the seeds of discontent. We know historically emissions have continued to increase despite myriad international agreements, and we know that the Paris Agreement is destined to fail unless we start to deal with issues like border tax adjustments, which would ensure a level playing field for those jurisdictions who actually implement aggressive internal carbon pricing mechanisms and aren't penalized by World Trade Organization and others for doing so. We know what all the solutions are. They fall in 3 categories: technological, behavioral, and market instruments. And we have in place policy pathways to actually take advantage of these. I would argue that climate change actually presents the greatest opportunity for innovation, creativity, and economic prosperity the world's ever seen. Because I also would argue that we should view each environmental challenge through the lens of the opportunity it creates for creativity and innovation in solving that challenge. And rather than dwelling on the hopelessness of this issue, we can focus on the development of develop solutions, so-called wise hope. There's so many opportunities for innovation in emissions reduction, creation of negative emissions technologies. And we have in place in BC now policy pathways that will help us get to the emissions reductions. And those policy pathways, without going into details, focus on the various sectors, of which the built environment is non-trivial. 13% of emissions in BC come from buildings. We also had an update to that initial plan recently, and that is also taken, again, looking at buildings and communities, and buildings is significant emissions embodied in buildings. And there is plans and processes moving forward that hopefully will recognize the opportunities as a consequence of that. Certainly, we also see that in the economic plan in BC now too, which is recognizing that prosperity lies in dealing with these issues. So finally, I'll conclude by saying the international science community has done its job. Frankly, if we're going to deal with the issue, it's time for governments to do theirs. And the question I ask you is, I truly believe we have reached a tipping point in public opinion, thanks to Greta Thunberg and her climate strikes. However, there's still a danger that if we don't change the narrative and move away from complaining and protesting what we don't like and telling people and yelling at the clouds about what we dislike, that we need to actually also focus our attention on advocating for what we want instead. And that has been the approach I took in the legislature for 7.5 years, is not to say no, but to say rather than doing this, these are the alternates that we can follow and the pathways we can take. I'm so very pleased that we're seeing that actually happening in the province of BC now, and federally as well on the climate file. Thank you.
So my name is Jed McLean, and in about 1995, I took all of my research. I was then a university professor, a colleague of Andrew's, and started focusing on climate solutions, principally in the form of hydrogen technologies at that point. And since then, I've done the university stuff. I've been an entrepreneur, started companies that build hydrogen fuel cell technology, worked in climate solutions research support through the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions. And now I'm working in this new organization called the Center for Innovation and Clean Energy, which I'll say more about as a part of my talk. You know, Andrew's presentation was great in terms of a bit of background. And, you know, I just presume that in a professional audience such as this, everybody is more or less understanding the drivers of climate change and the severity of the problem. But just a few little comments that the International Energy Agency on Tuesday issued a report stating that CO2 emissions in the globe were the highest in 2021 that have ever been recorded, and that doesn't include methane emissions, 6% higher than 2020. So through COVID, there were lots of proclamations that there'd be a green recovery, and now there's, I think, a dawning recognition that emissions have never been higher, in spite of things like our Paris Accords and accords that came before that. Another comment that I would make is attribution science is making great strides, and at UVic, actually, in the PCAIC organization, and perhaps Andrew knows more about this than me, the ability now to attribute extreme weather events as being more likely due to climate change may actually begin to become important in terms of attributing costs and starting to identify what the actual cost of climate change already is. And this will be an important motivator for the private sector, I think. And, you know, just to put this in perspective of why are we worried and why is it time for action now, just give you one example. In 2017 and 18 in British Columbia, we had 2 years of extreme wildfire seasons. And the emissions in each of those years from the wildfires was 3 times the anthropogenic emissions in those years in British Columbia. So I'm just going to pause and repeat that. So, you know, remember the big wildfire years, the emissions from the wildfires 3 times all of the other emissions in the province in each of those years. And if you look in Australia more recently, same kind of ratios. Siberia, I haven't seen any accounting for it, but you know, we're starting to see these extreme events that are incredibly costly, and they aren't helping in terms of our path to reducing CO2 concentrations. So what do we do? And what I want to do is just quickly drive down into the day-to-day of your architectural practice, if you'll allow me. I'm an engineer who's interested in design. I'm interested in making things and very much resonate with the idea of what architecture is all about. There's three big buckets for action. Number one, we got to adapt to a changing climate. Obvious, right? Easier said than done. Number two, the big issue is we've got to stop making the problem worse. So we've got to mitigate. And number three, and this actually brings up some very interesting linkages back to our first presentation, we need to remediate. And sooner or later, and Andrew mentioned negative emissions, sooner or later we're going to draw down CO2 levels, which means we're going to choose a design point for CO2 in the atmosphere that we will drive toward as a target. And that has massive implications for the globe, but I won't be able to go there today and talk about that. All of these three activities are needed. It's not an either or, it's a must do in every case. So governments obviously are helping and leading the way, and I'm very proud to live in British Columbia where we have Clean BC. I think it's fantastic. We have things like low carbon fuel standards. Maybe we'll hear more about stuff like that in a second. Governments can help. As professionals who are designing the future, I believe we all have an obligation to design a benevolent future that's consistent with our climate objectives. And that's a challenge to your professional organization and to me personally. And again, as Andrew hinted, I think that there is an enormous commercial opportunity. And so we can use, whether you like them or not, we can use the mechanisms of capitalism to move us in the direction of a benevolent future. And that's very much the work that I'm focused in with CICE. We support the commercialization and scaling of built-in British Columbia greenhouse gas emission reduction technologies. That's what we do. So issues in the built environment, 10%, 13% of our emissions are from buildings. The Clean BC report states that communities, which you design, directly influence 50% of emissions in the province. You, through your design efforts and through your efforts to maintain the built environment, actually are determining how we achieve that future. Are we on the RPC 2.5 or RPC 8.5? Where are we going? You're responsible for that. And I think you've got a hell of a burden, excuse my word there, because you've got to maintain the existing built environment. You've got to adapt to this changing climate. And then you've got to think about a future environment that will mitigate. You've got a built environment infrastructure that's got maybe a 20 to 40 year lifetime before it's disappeared. And the buildings that you build and the communities that you design today will persist for 50 to 75 years. So what you do in the next year profoundly influences the trajectory that we are on for meeting all of our climate objectives to achieve a sort of a zero emission world. And I think that that's a tall order. And I'm very pleased that you're asking the questions and pleased to have this opportunity to speak to you today. There's one comment that I would like to make about buildings and efficiency, and I could go on for a long time and I'll stop. And that is that I see there's a dominant ethos today toward efficiency and energy efficiency, and I'm an energy systems person. I think that that narrative has to change toward carbon intensity, because energy efficiency, you could be more and more efficient, but you can consume more and more of whatever service is being driven by that energy and actually have greater emissions. But when you move away and you change the carbon intensity of the energy and of the services that you're consuming, then you start to have a metric which actually makes sense and is aligned with our climate objectives. So for me, the move toward life cycle analysis and carbon intensity as a primary value ahead of efficiency is a major thought shift that we have to get to. So can we do more? Yes. I actually have a very hopeful agenda, and we just issued a call for proposals. In 4 weeks, our organization received 62 proposals for about $60 million worth of projects in British Columbia from British Columbia companies, all of which had as its first objective, its first key performance, greenhouse gas emission reduction. I am very optimistic about what we can do in the future, but we have to increase our ambition and keep our eye on the prize, which is carbon reduction. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Jed, that's great. You've really created a wave for our next presenter, Tiffany Warkinson. Again, Tiffany, for those of you who came late, is the Acting Director, Strategic Policy for Building and Safety Standards Branch with British Columbia. And we will have a roundtable following her presentation, so there'll be more from everyone.
So thank you so much for having me today, and thank you to my colleagues who set me up so well for what I'm about to talk about here. A lot of the comments that you've already heard really form a foundation for what I'm here to say. And I guess I'll start by saying, you know, I join you from the Building and Safety Standards branch, which is responsible for regulation of construction and safety standards for buildings in BC. And that's, you know, one small piece of one part of the larger BC strategy in terms of climate change. And so we're really working across government with our colleagues to dovetail the work that we're doing with the actions that they're taking. And as participants in the larger national code system, we work with our provincial and territorial counterparts to influence and inform the direction of national code development. And we're also committed to harmonizing across the country under the Construction Codes Reconciliation Agreement, which is part of our Canadian Free Trade Agreements. So you can see in this diagram here, we're kind of the hub of the wheel with this continuous feedback loop with, you know, national on one side and those people who are using and most directly influenced by the code on the other. And in that sphere are local governments, and our building regulatory system has a model of enforcement that is administered and overseen by local governments. So all the work that we're doing at the national level and at the provincial level also needs to reflect the needs and interests of those parties, because if they don't, they can choose not to administer and enforce those requirements. So there's a huge diversity there. Consider, for example, a jurisdiction like the City of Victoria and what they might need and want versus the village of Burns Lake and sort of what their resources and capacity are and interests are. They're very, very different. And so we're balancing a lot of different players as part of this picture. So when I talk about policy development, what I'm talking about is actually a whole package of things. So sometimes policy work is a push, sometimes it's a pull, and a big key to our overall success with a lot of these initiatives is market transformation. In order to be successful in achieving our policy objectives, the groundwork needs to be laid that creates the conditions that will enable the desired policy outcomes. So in this wave that you can see here on the slide now, that's kind of an example of what policy development might look like in the context of an energy efficiency code for existing buildings. We start with the data analysis and looking for lessons from other jurisdictions and voluntary initiatives, and we're building on those insights when we advise our colleagues about some of the incentives and programs that you're seeing now that will help create that market readiness to prepare the way for the changes that are coming. And introducing regulations kind of comes near the end of that, essentially formalizing all those lessons and capitalizing on the conditions that we've created over the course of that wave. A couple of things that we're working on right now. Right now, we're working with our national partners in the national process to develop the energy efficiency requirements for existing buildings. So we were really gratified to see the recent alignment between our own ministry's mandate with those of the federal ministries of Innovation, Science, and Industry, and the Ministry of Natural Resources. And you know, the objective is really to complement the space and water heating equipment standards that we know our colleagues in energy mines and low carbon innovation are developing. So regulating both from the supply chain end and from the installation end to make sure that those dovetail together. Concurrently, we're also examining opportunities to increase the resilience of existing buildings to climate hazards. So that concept that Jed talked about, where we're both mitigating current effects, but also working to implement strategies that will help us avoid future impacts and minimize future impacts so that we're moving things in the right direction from both ends. On the new construction side, by the end of 2022, the minimum requirement for energy efficiency of new construction will be 20% more efficient. And we're also working on operational carbon emission standards. So these are going to build on the familiar tiered approach that we introduced with the STEP code. The idea being to incrementally move folks along from decarbonizing one major system, either space or water heating, then both major systems, then all of their systems. So building on that efficient use of energy, making the most efficient use of decarbonized energy as well, dovetailing those together. Now, I've talked a lot about climate-related work, but I want to just for a minute pause and paint a picture of the larger context. So this government has a lot of important policy goals that we're committed to advancing. And this slide here shows that list of initiatives I was just talking about, sort of right up against some of the other really big important initiatives that our government is committed to. Things like affordable, accessible housing and harmonization of national codes and economic recovery. And some of the tensions are probably pretty obvious to you, but a couple that come to mind right away. How does adding stringency to building standards affect cost? Certainly it's going to have cost implications of some kind. So how do we balance those sort of competing needs of access to affordable housing and access to environmentally sustainable housing? How might accessible design principles interact with energy efficiency or carbon emissions objectives? Something that we're looking at right now. And we also know, as Jed and others mentioned, I think that buildings that are being built right now are going to be around in 2030 and 2050 and beyond. So it's important to start taking action right away. And this infographic is a really high-level snapshot of what we know about the building regulatory ecosystem and how a building will interact with all of these different players over its lifetime. It's a bit of a simplification, but you can see that there's a number of different touch points. And what I'm highlighting here for you guys is the role that professionals like yourselves play at different points through the life cycle of a building. And in government, we find it's necessary to speak in generalities, but professionals like you all work together as a team at the client level to work on a specific project. And we've had really great advice that these kinds of goals that we're talking about here really require an integrated approach to design and build. So trying to tack on step code or other code requirements after a design is complete is not really that effective, cost-wise or otherwise. So that means that all the members of the team need to really start now implementing new ways of doing and thinking about their work and making sure that they're considering those factors right from the start, right from site selection. And we've heard from lots of professionals that a clear understanding of how one another's disciplines work and interact is critical to the overall success of some of these initiatives. And we also know that it falls to professionals like you on the ground to make the case for these safe, sustainable designs, and nobody wants to be the bad guy. So one of the things we're really interested in the branch is what consumer information or resources do folks like you need in order to give that great client advice and find creative ways to deliver affordable, accessible solutions that achieve these climate goals? It's a tall order, and creativity. This is as Jed said, the opportunity for innovation, or was it Andrew? I don't know. One of you said opportunity for innovation is big here. So there are a number of ways to get involved. There's, the indirect representation that you get from AIBC as part of the code development processes, but there's also more direct contributions that are possible through Codes Canada committees or working groups, or as part of the Energy Step Code Council subcommittees and working groups. So I encourage you to check out those sites there. Also, if you're interested in submitting a code change, you can find information on that on the National Codes website. I've also included the branch contact information if you'd like to be added to our contact list for consideration for upcoming policy engagements. And that's my spiel. Thanks so much.
Again, that was just terrific. Thank you, Tiffany. So we're going to open the floor, really. We have a generous amount of time for an open panel discussion, so I want the panelists to relax and enjoy themselves and stretch out and wander in whatever tangents they like. 40 minutes or so, 35, 40 minutes should still allow the chapter participants to pipe up and put questions and throw in curveballs as well. So the panel has done a great job, and I'd just like you all to venture forth into the topic. We're all feeling quite entangled, so get us further entangled, please. Thank you.
I'd really like to know from Tiffany how the building code is going to roll out in detail in terms of energy and passive housing and things like that, with a little more detail, if she is willing to expand upon that from Clean BC.
So you can see that the timeline along the side here, and this was something that we learned was really important to do from industry as part of our initial consultations on the Energy Step Code was lay out the roadmap far in advance. Tell us what the runway looks like and when the steps, the increments are going to increase, so that we have a long period of time to prepare. So you can see that 2022 is the 20% improvement, 2027 is the 40% improvement, and 2032 is the 80% improvement in terms of step code. And you're going to see a similar transition for carbon standards. We're getting ready to put those out for public review in the spring, but we know that the commitment from the Clean BC roadmap is to phase those over 2024, 2027, and 2030. And if you were paying very close attention, you might have noticed that those dovetail really nicely with the one major system, two major systems, all systems decarbonization concept that I was talking about earlier. So that's, you know, the pathway in terms of timing. The particulars of code language, I'm probably not the best person to speak with you about that. I'm more of a policy wonk than a technical person, but really trying to build on what we've already got in terms of the structure and the way that the code handles those concepts. Looking at ways to make these kinds of changes really accessible to industry. So creating one standard that applies to all climate zones rather than multiple standards that apply to, you know, each individual climate zone, because we find that creates a lot of confusion, and really it's not necessary in terms of incenting the overall behavior that we're trying to incent. Looking at whether there is a prescriptive path, particularly for Part 9 housing, which doesn't always involve professionals, so that builders have a really clear sense of what do I need to do in order to meet that standard. Those are the kinds of things that we're thinking about with our carbon standards development. Did that answer your question, Andrew?
It does. Could I just have one small follow-up, which is, what about use of concrete? And so part of the issues that I've wondered about in BC is government has the ability to use its significant capital power to actually show leadership in the construction of schools, hospitals, and the type of products that are used. To this date, government really hasn't done what it could have done in this regard. It was viewing the construction of schools and hospitals through the lens pretty much of save money in capital costs, not so much thinking about long-term operating. So my question to you is, to what extent is government thinking of actually changing its whole approach to its own design of its own buildings and its own capital stock, in terms of the type of concrete it's using, whether it's using, you know, carbon cure type concrete, which injects carbon dioxide into the concrete to actually eliminate the ability, the concrete CO2 coming from calcium carbonate in the cement production, whether it be energy passive, percentage of passive buildings, whether it be a requirement. What's government doing to show the leadership that it wants the rest of BC to do?
Well, I'm speaking a little bit outside my lane here, but I am aware that my colleagues in the capital projects areas are looking at with you know, making a focused effort to look at how they can walk the walk, not just talk the talk, in terms of the buildings that they build and how they can make them more sustainable in terms of things like tall wood or embodied carbon, or higher standards of efficiency and carbon emissions reductions than even the minimum standard. So really trying to sort of pave the way and be the leaders and blaze the trail with the projects that are starting to go forward now. And you've probably seen mention of a couple of those projects in the news. RBCM comes to mind. I know that they've been talking about the new museum for a while. So that's one of the current projects that's really taking a hard look at how can we make this building all of the things it needs to be, and a real showcase for the kinds of changes that we need to be making in the building sphere.
I'm noticing there's a few questions already coming in from the crowd, if we're willing to entertain those now.
Yeah, let's throw in more voices. Although the panelists are on the floor, so, and I also wanted to throw in the comment that architects very much involved in buildings, but we're also seers of cities. We're involved in the planning of cities, so urban planning is part of this topic as well. So Andy, let people in just to say they want to offer their questions.
Looks like Jed would like to say something, so we can start.
Yeah, I just like to engage with Patrick a little bit, and it's interesting you just made the comment about the cities. One of the things that I think is particularly interesting to me, but also I think essential, is moving away from the device and more toward the system. And that's my technical bias showing through. So I apologize for that in the context of ecology. But the design of urban spaces, and now increasingly the design of managed natural spaces, and I would submit that British Columbia is perhaps the world's largest tree farm, but it's all under management, right? The whole province is under management. These are, there are conscious decisions that are made in when we set these things up, right? These are sort of like the design parameters and the design ethos that we bring to it. And what I struggle with is, how do we move that big picture thinking about the design of these spaces from individual buildings to communities to cities to manage natural spaces, if that's not an oxymoron? How do we move that thinking to be consistent with a future climate vision? And how much influence can we have there against the sort of the consumer pull for lowest cost and for sort of incremental expansion, building by building or cul-de-sac by cul-de-sac? So I just want to set you up, Patrick. I'm interested in your view about that implementation of a better, let's call it a better vision for the built environment.
Patrick, you're just on mute there.
It's an excellent question, Jed. And the term we use is a desired future condition, a DFC. What is that future condition that an individual, a neighborhood, a community, a municipality, a province, just keep scaling up, have for themselves? And what I find is there are two contrasting processes that are going on. The first is one that is, for me, is very concerning. It's a deepening ignorance of an entire generation of anything to do with nature. So it's not about going to a skating park or a park in a city. It's about literally, how does nature function, the wildlife of the planet, microscopically, macroscopically. And it's largely that, as I've seen over 40 plus years, people don't grow up in farms anymore. And for the moment, we'll focus on, let's just say, North America or a large part of Europe. So that connection with nature that begins from a very early age is gone. It also means that their parents didn't come from farms, and neither did their aunts and uncles, oftentimes grandparents, but the kids don't have any connection to the land anymore. And it profoundly changes the way they think about the kind of issues we're talking about. The other one is really about building capacity for collaborative stewardship. So the way that we work with developers directly is, if you take this engineered ecology, this eco-mimicry design mode, will it actually be more profitable? Profitability as defined by the developer, not by a sustainability guru. It literally has to be more profitable. Otherwise, why would they do it? And again, that scales when you look at a community. So if a community has a large complex of watershed supplying its drinking water, and it mismanages or others mismanage that forest, you end up with what happened in Sumas. You needed a small rowboat to check into the hotel because the lobby was 5 feet underwater. And why was that? Because we've literally wiped out the forest stand structure in all the watersheds that ultimately drain down through the Sumas and into the Fraser. And that we can't change that anytime in the next 100 years. So, I mean, the irony is, the only thing I know as an ecologist is just about the money. There's a twist to that we won't go into, but it's trying to understand the financing. How is it that somebody will view something differently? And if we can talk to them about the money, that's hugely important. They're at least willing to listen. If I tell them it's going to cost you twice as much, they just run for the hills. The other element in all of this, and I'm keen to get both your and Andrew's perspective and Tiffany's, from a slightly different perspective than you guys. Banks and insurance companies are really struggling to understand how they're going to work together, which they typically have not done, in order to understand what's a safe loan, what's a safe risk.
Mhm.
The moment an insurance company, especially a reinsurance company like Swiss or AIG, discovers that that's a 1 in 50 likelihood of occurrence, they're not going to write a policy that anybody can afford. So if you already own a building, you've now got a stranded financial asset. If you're planning on building something, you've got to go to a bank and try to convince them to loan you the money when they're very concerned that the insurance policy is going to be too high to maintain. And I can assure you, insurance policies are not going to start dropping in cost in the near future. So these are the kind of mixes that we work with. And again, we work on a wide range of landscapes, from urban centers like here in Vancouver to big watersheds in the East Coast, or in the east part of the province, in the Cranbrook, Kimberley, that area. It's a real challenge, Jed. It really and truly is. But from our perspective, it really is about building capacity for collaborative stewardship. The other one I have much more difficulty with, and that is the education system is not producing individuals that understand a large part of what we're talking about. They have the words, but they don't have the comprehension. I'll leave it at that.
Just a comment. There's an organization that was created a few years ago called the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. And a big player in that is a fellow named Blair Feltmate from the University of Waterloo.
Mm-hmm.
And he has done an awful lot with the insurance and reinsurance issue that you mentioned vis-a-vis flooding. So more in central Canada, flooding of houses it's now a major concern. And recently, the Canadian government sort of put out a new set of maps defining where the floodplains are based on the new reality. And a lot of people have found their property value being decreased because of rewriting the map. And it is a massive issue. But to turn it around into a positive issue, when you start to see this scale of finance getting concerned about climate change solutions and climate change issues, we suddenly start to see the levers of change emerging, right?
Yes.
So I think that it's important for us to set ourselves up as a society to be able to pull those levers when they're presented to us. So we've got to have options, we've got to have alternatives ready to go, and the finance will come. The tragedy will be if the finance doesn't come until there's been massive human suffering on a global scale. Yeah. And that's what we hope to avoid, but that's perhaps beyond today's discussion.
Yeah, Dr. Spencer Glendon from the Woods Hole Institute on Cape Cod has done a lot of work on this particular issue of at what point does, as Andrew's diagrams were showing, does a country or a location become uninhabitable because it's too hot, or the flooding is so excessive that you can't live there anymore. And what do those people do? They move. They become ecological migrants or climate migrants. And that has a huge destabilizing effect on whence they've come from, but also where they're going. I mean, we're seeing that play out in a very different political climate right now between Russia and the Ukraine. Not driven by climate per se, but it is driven by a political climate objective, which is to go back 200 years in time and recapture a Soviet or a Russia that hasn't existed for a very long time, pre-1914 for sure. Yeah, but I think you're right. Once the big money becomes involved, then everybody has to dance to the tune of the piper.
And that's an opportunity, right? We should view that.
Yeah.
And we should view that moment as hope. But what we want is we want that moment to happen motivated by a recognition of future costs, not motivated by what they just paid out.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I completely agree.
That's
and look on the boards of these companies for climate scientists, not sustainability people, actual climate scientists and ecologists. When you see a board that has a number of these individuals on them with lots of experience, you've probably got a board that is tackling the kinds of issues we're talking about here today.
There's a comment on the chat about wildfires, and I'd encourage everybody to look at it. I was involved through my work at the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions in creating a Canadian and American project, 5-year project, looking at carbon and wildfires. And just addressing this question of what do you do now that you recognize how vulnerable both our forests are for these massive emissions, but also the people who live in those forests are incredibly at risk, as we see. So this is speaking to this point of adaptation that I was mentioning, that the burden is to redesign our communities so that they're wildfire resilient. And the choices that have to be made there are just horrible, horrible choices, because the reason a lot of people live in those environments to begin with is about to be taken away in order to protect those places. And it's just a horrible choice. And I know that Whistler is coming up with a new plan that I saw some presentations on a few years ago, to really create a no fire zone within a certain distance of any residences. And it's being very artfully done and well designed, but massive gravel pits basically, as a perimeter, almost like a moat around the city. So this is being worked on, and I know that the provincial government is asking more and more questions about how they manage their forests for climate change resilient future. The trouble is, and this is maybe a question that we can talk about, and maybe Andrew can address a little bit from his scientific background. What climate are we designing for? Is it a 2-degree climate? Is it a 3-degree climate? Or is it a climate where the temperature just keeps going and going and going? As people who design things, right, you need some parameters to constrain your design.
This is why the whole narrative of discussing an adaptation strategy makes no sense unless you couple it with a mitigation strategy, because otherwise you don't know what you're adapting to. Right. Because if we just say, let's do adapt, okay, we're going to adapt to the 100-year rain event for the building of our storm drain systems in big cities. Means nothing, because today's 100-year event is not tomorrow's 100-year event. So really, this is a very big challenge that requires a coupling, a mirrored coupling of adaptation and a global mitigation strategy. The adaptation strategy, I'm afraid, has to be quite far out, because as it stands right now, we're not on track for keeping warming anything below 3 degrees. That's literally the direction we're heading. We have passed 1.5 degrees. Despite the rhetoric out there, it is impossible to keep warming below 1.5 degrees. It was impossible on the day that the IPCC released that report, and the scientists who wrote it knew that. But that report was tasked not by scientists, but by political leaders to develop pathways that could keep warming to 1.5 degrees, despite the fact that those pathways are impossible to meet because they require negative emissions using technologies that don't exist immediately. So we're looking at 2 to 3 degree warming, and assuming we get on with it now. And that's significant and serious, but manageable. So the question is there a political and societal will to deal with this now? Because waiting till tomorrow is waiting till it's too late. I mean, there may not, the answer to that is not necessarily yes. I mean, that is the existential question of our time. Do we care about intergenerational equity? If we do not, who cares about global warming? If we do, we must act now. For if we don't, we're essentially showing that we don't care about intergenerational equity. Kind of somber testament to how screwed we are unless we actually get on with dealing with this problem. And again, we have all the policy federally and provincially in Canada. We have provincially in BC, federally in Canada. We have policy in place now, umbrella policy, that will take us in a direction we need to go. The problem I see in civil society is that there are those for which progress is never good enough. Perfection is the only quest. And in the quest for perfection, progress is a casualty. And what ends up happening is political pendulums swing. To me, it's this, I applaud the government. I want to ask Tiffany a question based on your comment about the future, like the design parameters for the future, just to be a bit more technical. But I think it's incumbent upon us all, both as individuals and as professionals,
to start showing up in a way that really reflects that we care about this. And I will confess, personally, a sort of a cognitive dissonance in myself that I struggle with, in that, you know, I probably know more, I can spout off all the data that you want, you know, it's just emblazoned in my head. And yet, what's my plan to get to zero carbon in my life? I don't have one. I do my best, but at the same time, I'm not there. So if I don't have a vision for that, what do I expect? That some parent figure is going to treat me like a child and say, this is how you should behave? Like, we are the parent figures who have to figure out how we're going to go forward. It's on us. And I think government needs our help, right? Professionals and as individuals, that we want this because we want a just future. And, you know, away we go. Now, technical question, Tiffany, and it's a struggling question. I think it's a hard one to answer. So I'm not trying to put you on the spot. But how do you anticipate the future climate in coming up and evaluating your policies and ensuring that your policies are going to be compatible with this future climate that we're hurtling toward?
Well, and it's a good question. I wouldn't say that I've solved it, although if I had, I'd probably be a millionaire. But I can tell you that we're working really hard with our partners at NRCan to talk about, what are we using the right climate data? What shifts do we need to make so that we're looking at future shifted climate data that will help drive the behaviors that we need to implement now in order to be prepared for what we already know is coming. And the wave is moving at such a pace and with enough unpredictability that that's a really hard question to answer in some cases. But it is something that, you know, we're working through and we're talking about weekly, daily sometimes with our national partners.
Well, I commend your efforts. Thank you.
Andrew, a question for you, just coming back to something that you were saying earlier. We're a very small, tiny part of the world here in BC and even in Canada. So how can we influence what goes on elsewhere at scales that dwarf anything that we can do here?
Well,
And I'm not being negative in that context.
It's so couple of things. First off, there's the atmospheric carbon, anthropogenic carbon released to the atmosphere affects climate not only in the year it's released, but for a very long time after. What matters for climate change is not the emissions in any year, but the cumulative emissions.
Mm-hmm.
So off the bat, I can say that Canada and India are on par, even though India has 38.6 times the population of Canada. Since industrialization, Canada's cumulative emissions are only 1.8 times lower than India's. So Canada and India are on par in terms of contributions to where we are today. So we can't just turn around and tell India, oh, we know what's wrong, do as we say, not as we do. Mm-hmm. Canada, unlike all the other Annex I nations that signed Kyoto, did not meet its target. But Kyoto was a success because every nation that signed Kyoto met its target, except Canada and the US, which pulled out, but the US still reduced emissions. So again, we in Canada often look and say, oh, we're really good and we're doing what we can, but we're not. Mm-hmm. Our emissions are up something like 27% from 1990 levels. UK's emissions are 45% below 1990 levels. So it's all about political will. And frankly, I will say to those out there who drove their cars today, you're knowing exactly what it's costing you not to get with the program. Because I've had an electric car for 7 years now, and I couldn't give a rat's patootie about the price of gas because it doesn't affect me. And I have 2 electric cars, and I have 0 emissions in my household of greenhouse gases. And I save money every day of the week because I do that. And so it makes no sense from a fiscal point of view to continue with combustion of fossil fuels. The cheapest production of grid-based electricity is now solar over coal. It makes no sense to buy a gas vehicle because the second you drive it out of the car lot, you start saving money if you have an EV, even if you 100% finance it, because the financing costs are less than what you pay on oil and filter and gasoline. There's an awful lot of people who don't think this through from an economic perspective. Finally, if I go to places like China, which I am not worried about in the slightest, they have an autocratic governance structure. So when China decides that they want to build the Three Gorges Dam, China decrees that thou shalt move out of cities millions of people, and we're going to flood your cities. When China decides it's going to eliminate plastic bags, China says we eliminate plastic bags, and it does. China's gone all in renewable energy because it recognizes the strategic business opportunity for prosperity as an early adopter and leader. Canada, as a Luddite, is continuing to try to produce some of the most expensive and least attractive oil resources on the planet. That is the highly sulfur-laden bituminous sands out of Alberta, for which there is no market because the bunker fuels are moving away from sulfur-laden diesel bunker fuels. They're moving towards natural gas and other mechanisms. So it is continued folly to think that we should continue doing what we've been doing, because that's a recipe for disaster. So in essence, again, so coming back to the question, comparing Canada with elsewhere, if everyone took Canada's position, we are hooped. Canada is a wealthy nation. Canada is a significant contributor to the global problem. Per capita, it is one of the highest in the world. And Canada likes to pride itself as brokers of goodwill and brokers of international deals. And right now, Canada is viewed historically as a pariah on the climate change file. So there's a whole bunch of reasons for Canada to get with the program, not the least of which is the fact that it's viewed as a pariah on this file by the rest of the world. But the good thing with that is Trudeau, and through the good grace of Jonathan Wilkinson as the environment minister, has put in place one of the world's best climate plans. And the beauty of that plan is it's basically the BC plan scaled up to Canada, and they fit in like this together with the BC plan, because the federal government and the BC government have such a really good working relationship on this file.
I didn't want to imply that Canada was at the top of the pile. I was thinking actually more along the line of what you're saying, that we've actually dropped the ball and we have ceased being the innovators we were maybe 20 years ago.
Exactly. Canada, we were leaders on so many environmental issues. We are not a leader on this. We could have been. We have the leading scientific community, one of the leading scientific community in the world. How many people here, even on this call, know that in Victoria, we have the Canadian Centre for Climate Modelling and Analysis, which is one of probably half a dozen groups internationally that are at the forefront of climate modeling and climate science. Like, people don't know that. We have it all here, but we cannot get out of our way because we love to, as I think this is Jed's your expression, Canada really loves to bronze its gold medals, is that we have the potential for leadership, but we're afraid to lead and tell others. Canada's role on leadership, BC's role in leadership is, let's wait and see what others do, and then we'll do that too. But that's not leadership.
No,
that's what we have to move away from, is waiting for others and taking advantage of these opportunities, because that's what they are, in my view. Sorry, I rambled there. It was a diatribe, if ever I had one before.
no,
It's never happened before.
no. Just nice to be here when it happened the first time. It really is. Your point just is really at the core of evolution. Evolution builds on change, and you have a huge investment in change. 99% of it just fails. Wrong place, wrong time.
Yeah.
But that 1% changes everything, and everything is restructured very quickly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Look at the zero emission. Here's a piece of policy example in BC. This is the one that I specifically focused a lot of my energy on this zero emission vehicle mandate in BC. And the reason why that was the attention was put there is 40% of BC's emissions come from transportation. You cannot have a credible climate plan in BC without dealing with that big piece of the pie. I mean, there's still 12%, I think it was, on buildings. That's another big piece of the pie. But of that 40%, the ZEV mandate had to be addressed. In the initial negotiations we had in Clean BC, government was putting numbers like, 10% by 2030. Well, that wasn't very bold. That wasn't leadership. We got it up to something like 40%, 100% by 2040. And now everyone's going on top of each other. It's so much so that I don't even know what the ZEV mandate is now in BC. I think it's 95% by 2030, something crazy. And what has happened is the public response to that ZEV mandate is out of control. We met our 2025 target before the end of the year in which we introduced the ZEV mandate. Like, this is how successful some of these programs are, because there's such an appetite within broader public to take advantage or to actually do something. People want to do something. They want to know how to help. And government's role is to give them the tools with which they can feel good about actually contributing to this problem. And with architects, you all have the tools to help contribute through the construction of the next generation of built environment. With the assistance of government, who's fixing all those weird regulations that mean on the corner of Fort Street and Foul Bay, depending on whether you're in Victoria, Saanich, or Oak Bay, you have three completely different set of building rules and regs.
Build on that, I think the question for Tiffany might be like, how come we're not just doing passive house now? Why can't we just mandate all buildings are passive? Like, we have the technology, we know how much more it's going to cost. If we just leveled the playing field at a higher level, I'd be interested to hear what the considerations are behind.
Well, I mean, it goes back to that comment I made about the differing interests and needs and capacity of differing jurisdictions. So with local government enforcement, one of the things that we know is that if you set the cost of entry so high that it's not possible to engage, they simply won't. So, you know, you kind of end up in this catch-22 where I can set the world's most stringent standard, but if only a handful of jurisdictions in the Lower Mainland and on the island are enforcing that standard, what effect can it have? And maybe it makes more sense, as you saw that we did with the STEP code, and as we're planning to do with the carbon standards, to make multiple tiers available so that those who are ambitious and aggressive and have the capacity to move faster can, and those that have lesser resources and longer to go in terms of reaching capacity can still do something and make that incremental change that we're talking about without feeling like they're just priced out of the market, so to speak, by the level of investment that they'd need to make to get there.
So here's to you, Tiffany, is there a different way of thinking of this outside the box way, for example? My understanding is to go passive from regulators about 10% capital, right? Is that correct, Andy? 10% increase on capital construction cost?
I don't know all the statistics, but in our experience, it's about that. In our projects,
I've heard that from multiple sources. Okay, so let's suppose hypothetically you're building a building for $1 million and it's 10% to go passive. Mm-hmm. Why is it that we're not exploring policy pathways whereby that extra 10% could actually be done through an interest-free loan guaranteed by government, BC Hydro, green bonds, or whatever, to give the capital, give the consumer the capital to actually incentivize them to go passive? It's only a very short incentive because once that becomes a social norm, obviously price drops. But there's other ways of doing it using the carrot and stick approach. And as government exploring, we did talk about this when we were negotiating Clean BC, means and ways of actually providing the consumer the ability to access the funds they require to go passive.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, PACE financing is a term that's been tossed around a lot. We're talking with our colleagues in Climate Action Secretariat and in tax policy about different packages of incentives and rebates and all of those carrots that we can offer to try and move people along on the voluntary scale while not leaving the folks who aren't ready or able to move yet behind entirely.
Because this is what we're seeing with electric vehicles, right? It's those early adopters who are, I mean, if I myself, Andrew Weaver, want to go and build a house that's passive, I actually don't know where I would go. I'd probably pick up the phone and I'd phone one of you guys, but most people don't even know where to go. So there's a capacity aspect. There's people want to make it, they don't have the information. So being able to assist those early adopters actually do the right thing that they want to do is huge.
Yeah.
And that happened with the EV, and that is why it's become a social norm now to drive electric vehicles, is because of all those people who paid way too much money for those early EVs, like me.
Sure, and I think Passive House Accelerator is doing a really great job in terms of getting the message out there about, you know, how it can be done and profiling really successful projects. So that's a great free resource.
How do we get the townhouse development on Shelbourne Street to become passive? I'm just making up something like that, right?
Yeah. Well,
and sure that Saanich also requires plugins, as well as Victoria, as well as Oak Bay, as well as Langford, because if you're in the corner of Fort and Foul Bay, you have to put EV chargings in the Victoria side. I don't think you have to in Oak Bay, and I don't think you could actually have rental in Oak Bay. And on the Saanich side, God only knows too, right? So there's there needs to be some consistency if we want to deal with this, I would think.
Yeah, and I would say we as government, while we're not at those planning team tables, we are doing what we can to bring people together. The Step Code Council is a great example of that, where we've got policymakers from all the different jurisdictions talking to one another, and really we're encouraging them, like, coordinate with your regional neighbors. Industry really values consistency. You guys need to work together.
Yeah.
I'm glad we're talking about cities, because in terms of getting our house in order, that's something that's right within reach. And cities can be beasts, you know, they can do everything we don't want them to do, or they can do everything that we want them to do. You can make a city, you can aim for walkability in a city, but you have to make it worth walking in. So there's a qualitative element to all these topics, which I think our profession is, you know, very equipped for. So densifying cities in a way that's workable, but also enjoyable. I mean, we can do that. And that's a contribution we can make right here.
I'd say that the truth of the matter is, having worked in the legislature, we actually have perhaps the best civil service in the country, in our province. We have so much skill here in our civil service because of, look where we live. We live in BC. It's beautiful. We can attract and retain the best and brightest, and they come here for the quality of life. So we have the skill set in the civil service to do the policy work that needs to be done. I just hope that at some point the communication, well, this is a means and ways of communicating, but that there's more communication between what is on the table for people to do and from those who are enabling what they can do, because there still is, I go back to standing on the side of the soccer field on Saturday morning. You know, you're sitting there watching your kids play soccer. You're worrying about the price of gas. You're not worried about climate change. You need to have help to help people. People want help to be able to help themselves, to help everybody. Again, I've talked too much, so I'll stop.
I'd just like to ask Tiffany a question about life cycle analysis and carbon intensity. So I mentioned in my opening talk that, you know, I think that there needs to be a big transition in our thinking away from energy efficiency. Not that that's unimportant, but think about just, you know, you can reduce and reduce and reduce your energy consumption, but if it's fossil energy, you're still emitting. And to Andrew's point, that it's an integral function, right? It's not an instantaneous function in time. It's the integral from negative infinity in time up until today. So even a small emission is going to accumulate over time. So Stephanie, how do we make the transition to consider life cycle emissions or embodied carbon in the built environment? And here's an example of what I'm thinking, right? You've got a 50-year-old building. It was built using horrible concrete or, you know, bad materials, or maybe it's made entirely out of wood, bare floors, all these nice heritage things that we like. And you're contemplating replacing it with a new high-performance building. The new building is obviously going to be better from an energy efficiency point of view. But if we think about that integral equation and the life cycle analysis, it may be that we're better off putting more time into the old, or consequently, it might be that we get rid of a lot of that mid-century stuff and replace it sooner, right? So at what point can we introduce a sort of a life cycle analysis, a carbon intensity point of view into our decision-making about the built environment and how it evolves or how it is designed as we go forward? Thinking about the existing infrastructure moving forward to the future.
Well, you've just encapsulated one of the big themes that's been coming up for us as part of our existing buildings engagement that we just went through on the policy side, because that is the question. You know, we're trying to create requirements for alterations to existing buildings that are not going to incent that kind of tear down and replace it with something new behavior, where ultimately the carbon impact is higher, right?
Yeah.
We need to find intelligent, thoughtful ways to improve the performance of the existing building where it makes sense in an incremental way that building owners can finance or afford in some way, while ultimately always moving towards that larger goal of reducing the life cycle, not just the today impacts.
I think that's where things have to go, because
Yeah.
I think that's when we really start to be understanding. But you see, the trouble is, it's difficult, right? I mean, I've used
It's really difficult.
I've used the word integral many times on purpose.
Yeah.
To make the point that speaks to me as a academic engineer very clearly. I understand what I'm saying, but if I spoke to a lot of people, they wouldn't really understand at first blush what that's all about. And I'll give you another example, and I just want to take issue with Andrew. I know. So you're all happy with your electric car. So two things. Number one, can you do the analysis for me about my 10-year-old car that I drive about 6,000 kilometers a year, as to whether it's better to throw that one out and buy a brand new spiffy electric car, or whether I should just suck up the embodied emissions that are already in that car and not have a new one built and pay for the emissions associated with operating. If you've got if you can solve that question for me, thank you very much. I mean, I'm interested in that. But this life cycle assessment, I think, is important. It's written into the low carbon fuel standards and the clean fuel standard for the country. So again, BC showing great leadership on the fuels side of things and the decarbonization of fuels. I'm not aware of what's going on in the built environment, because it's not really where I work on a day-to-day basis.
There was or Andrew, did you want to address that one? Or
No, I was just going to tell Jed. I mean, it depends. Like when your head gasket goes on your car, it tell you what you go and get an EV right away. Like,
well, that's a given, right? But I'm going to make this car
6,000. I suspect the embodied emissions are. I'm not going to do that calculation, but I think
right. Okay.
probably made the right decision to keep your.
But look on the chat. There's a couple of great comments on the chat about mode shifting and take the bus or bike. And this speaks to the design of our communities and the design of our infrastructure. And so it's back squarely, and I'm delighted to see those comments. What about further enhancement of what I would call mode shifting, helping the first and last kilometer around public transport, right? That's the big challenge, is how do you get to the bus and how do you get from the bus to your place of work or residence, et cetera. Can we address that from the architecture side? Can anybody going to weigh in on that and help me understand how we get those things going?
Well, we are going to weigh in because we've got the period for our participants, the chapter, to throw in questions and comments verbally, not to break the flow of the panelists, but if anyone's been waiting to make a comment, the floor is open now. So Andy, allow for any comments, and the panel can continue just as freely as you wish during this.
there were a few questions in the chat, and I don't know if we're going to be able to get to all of them, but there were a few good ones just around what kind of incentives or what kind of things are being put forward to help people kind of get on board with this, like the changes that are coming, but also, and I think in a broader way, how do you become not demoralized and demotivated, given that we're not meeting the 1.5 degrees, we're not hitting all the targets. How do we change the narrative so it doesn't become this hopeless kind of chasing something that we're never quite getting to?
Well, the last question is the easy question, because we can only do what we can do. And if you think about doing what you can do and not focusing on the bigger picture, that's all you can do. Live mindfully, day by day.
We can't do everything at once, but we must do something at once.
Exactly. I'm exactly with you there, Tiffany. We do what we can in ways we can. And that makes a difference, because every 1,000th of a degree warming we prevent is a good thing. Right? So let's do lots of good things.
Perfection is the enemy of the good, Andrew. This is the art of the adequate.
Absolutely, Patrick. I'm with you 100%. It was, I should have had that as a rallying cry in the 2017 election, because, oh my, the environmental community in this province, as you know, are very difficult to deal with, because in their quest for perfection, progress, and the good are casualties each and every time.
Yep, it's true. No, it's true.
It's BC is particularly weird that way. But.
And we need to remember that, at least from my perspective, that activists are always against something.
Right.
Advocates are always for something. If you need a lawyer, you don't go looking for an activist.
No,
you look for an advocate.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what this file needs, is it needs more people advocating for change, supporting the change, not criticizing just because they have to do something different.
But Andrew, to agree with you and not, or maybe just to expand and build on what you said, I think that there is a possibility, and again, it's, perfect is the enemy of good enough, that some of the loudest advocates for change get in the way of practical paths for change.
Yeah.
And this is really a problem that we have, in that we all have the same objective, but our approach to get there is differently motivated, and that just causes people to walk away. So I call it sort of like the global reset community, that I just, I'd love to have a world which runs purely on hydrogen, that was developed purely from electrolysis of water, and that recycles all the water from the use of hydrogen back into the production of hydrogen. I mean, it's a very beautiful system. I'd love to have the design of all of our communities in such a way that, everything's a 5-minute walk away for you, and we have old people and young people interacting. I would love all of these things.
And nobody gets sick, so everybody could ride a bike. And
okay. So
all the time. I want that too.
But the big but is, we've got the world that we've got the cities that we've got, and we have to find a way incrementally to move there. And I find in my work, I work on energy systems, and we actually talk about taking natural gas and making hydrogen from it. And the hue and cry about this kind of a thing from a certain sector of the world is like, they can't think of a worse thing to do. And yet we're looking at it saying, well, the carbon equation matches, we know where the carbon's going, so tick, and the cost is matching, and the supply is there. So as an incremental strategy, what's wrong with this? Like, what are we missing? But somehow it's ideologically frowned upon because it doesn't meet this perfection mindset. So that the challenge is, how do we have an incremental mindset that isn't criticized as selling out to the big interests, and which isn't thwarted by the idea that it's got to be perfect, or otherwise it's not worth doing? That's a real challenge. And when I said about the challenge for the architecture community, I think that's a challenge that you live every day, because you're making that build or destroy or change, or how do you design, you're making those decisions. I just really encourage you to be mindful about the climate in every decision, every little decision that's being made, right? It's hard. I don't think there's an easy answer.
So I'd like to invite one of our architects who had a question earlier. Erica, did you want to kind of chip in a comment? There she is.
Thank you. It's a little intimidating. It's been an amazing discussion, and really makes me very conscious of what I feel I should be doing better at. And I think that's the question I have is, it's great that the code is bringing in the carbon reductions, but is it, as practitioners, should we be just, I know the code is a minimum and we should be exceeding, but it's very hard to convince clients to pay for that cost, that incremental cost increase. And I think hopefully we do have this public will towards addressing climate change, it's not something that we see when we're working on developer projects. It doesn't sound like the people going into the display centers are saying, and what's the energy efficiency, and how is this going to prepare me for climate change, and how will it be a more resilient place for me to live? That doesn't seem to be getting into the marketing aspects. And so it's a big question. I know we should be advocating for this, but any thoughts in the work that you're all doing on what we should be drawing from in these conversations we have with our clients?
I think Victoria is the place where we I mean, you have a community that is willing to go. I bet if you, oh, well, how's Dockside Green going right now? The latest version of that. I mean, has it been oversubscribed? I'm not sure, but I would have thought that in BC, developers, I know the Tri-Eagle Group do a lot of developing of passive and other buildings, would have seen this as a strategic advantage in Victoria. So you're saying that's not the case? I mean, you're trying to find a leg up on your competition. In Victoria, we have Green versus NDP in elections, which is like super weird compared to the rest of the country. So I would have thought this jurisdiction, we might have had some hope for them knocking at the door. They don't do that to you? Is that what you?
Well, maybe no one's going to say anything because I'll try to get their clients if they've got better clients than me.
I have a thought on that. I don't know if I'm unmuted here, but I think part of the way that you can address that is for clients that are going to retain ownership long-term of a building. So those tend to be institutional clients and that nature. If you are looking at the lifetime costing of the building, so you actually discount the upfront capital costs of something like, say, a geothermal heating system, and actually you look at distributing that cost across the lifetime of the building. We've seen some traction when you start costing in that manner.
That makes sense, obviously, because you're saving in the long-term operating costs as well.
You still need to have the client that's willing to listen, but you can square the circle. The numbers do work as long as they're going to retain ownership.
Okay.
I think we're getting towards the closing of our time, but we do have another session coming up in April where this will all continue. And I'm going to invite the panelists back as observers, if they can fit it in, and also for them to continue, stirring the pot on this. I want to thank all the panelists and all the preparation that was done by Andy and Stacy and Nicole. Really good session. It really makes me proud to be a kind of architect of Victoria, to sort of hear all the interplay and to listen to some high-level insights in this. So I think we need more motivation, obviously, and this sort of discussion I think is invaluable. So I really want to thank the panelists for an exceptionally well done session, and also invite them back for our next session in 2 months when architects are going to be hopefully kind of putting the logs in the fire on the topic. Thank you again.